When somebody says trauma-informed, there's a spectrum of what that means.
You're listening to the Joyous Justice Podcast,
a weekly show hosted by April Baskin with Tracy Guy Decker.
In a complex world in which systemic oppression conditions us to deny others and our own humanity, let's dedicate ourselves to the pursuit and embodiment of wholeness, love, and thriving in the world and in our own lives. It's time to heal and flourish our way to a more joyously just future.
I've started to notice, and it started to agitate me, which is interesting to notice because separate lesson, but it's bringing up big feelings. So I can also explore within myself, why is it agitating me? When I see people talking about or inferring that they are trauma informed, and to me, it basically falls simply stated that on the surface level, and we're going to get into even more depth, that when people are saying trauma informed, my sense at times, in broad strokes, is that people are talking about trauma awareness and from a place of trauma limited. That there is trauma and therefore then we need to stop. That's it. And or it comes up in a few other ways, it can be a need for deep care, which in some ways can be very good. At times it can start to move into sort of coddling, and there's ways where I'm being intersectional here. The simple version, and then there's more to it, is, to me, when people say trauma informed, I place it in two basic categories, and then actually there's 4 levels of nuance, of trauma limited or trauma agile. And in short, trauma agile implies to me, or I'm seeing demonstrations of folks whose content is trauma agile, that it demonstrates that, and none of this in and of itself is bad per se, but depending upon the way people are wielding or using how they are inferring that they are trauma informed, can be irresponsible at times depending upon the context. But there's nothing wrong with different people being in different places of awareness or understanding. It's what they do with their positionality and how they leverage that. Right? But there are ways that people who are early, and so basically, I guess part of the overall headline of this is there's a tremendous amount that one can learn, and based upon the lessons and teachings that I've had in 30 years of learning about healing, and specifically 10 years of learning specifically counter-oppressive trauma healing, and learning from elders in this work in a counter-oppressive international decolonized, or endeavoring to continually decolonize, community and network of practitioners, that as humans, we have immense capacity to heal and to heal from trauma. And there is a huge pervasive belief that, side note or not side note, is deeply in support of keeping internalized and collective oppression locked in place, and also is deeply in service of keeping systemic oppression in place, because it's deeply in service of keeping people in a place of disempowerment. Right? Now, obviously, there's huge issues. I do not agree with multiple brilliant leaders out there who, I don't disagree, with multiple brilliant leaders out there who are saying, and I'm a part of that call, for there to be greater trauma-informed mental health services and also communal supports. And there's any number of ways that trauma can be addressed. And there's a plethora of ways that it can be addressed. That's not the main point of this talk today. What I want to talk about is this trauma-informed piece and kind of expand it out. Right? And so at times when I see people saying things like, there's just specific incidents that I can think of. So I've seen different examples in a number of different spaces, where basically the kind of memo is, this person, or I have trauma, therefore that whole area of living, the whole, at times just intimate relationships, family connections, different operating in different spaces, is no longer available to me. And what I would say is that they are at the level of trauma awareness that they have yet to learn about the other layers. And so their posts attempts not even meaning to convey that, like, okay, well, we're talking about trauma more now, but now that there's trauma here, there's nothing that can be done, which is very different than someone who might post something similar, but in terms of nuance and sophistication and implication, it is a vastly different message, right? Of someone who might post something similar, like, this is a place where I have a history of trauma. So right now I'm in a season of my life where I'm not engaging in these different ways, right? And again, to be very clear here, just briefly, I'm not talking about, for instance, perhaps some extenuating circumstance where there's a specific person or a particular place that is especially bad. I'm talking about a trend that hopefully a number of you have also noticed, not hopefully, but perhaps a number of you have also noticed, of folks saying, okay, there's trauma here, and so we can't do that. And there's this sense of disempowerment or just like finality. And that is so not the case. It would be as if, like, an equivalent, which I'm going to use a model for liberatory, I'm going to, in a moment, layer some of my understanding and what I'm proposing here as a way of thinking about this, about trauma, with Professor Barbara J. Love's liberatory consciousness model. But it'd be sort of like if someone said, oh, there's, like, well, I'm learning about and which is that actually happens to a ton of people. Someone who's been teaching about racial justice for 20 plus years, of like, oh, there's racism, so, like, there's nothing else to do. As opposed to, no, there is a whole world of healing and multiple steps that we can take to empower and equip and resource ourselves and other people. Okay, and again, talking about this kind of simultaneously at some points more than another, partially as practitioners who bring a trauma-informed lens, for those of us who do, and also as individuals thinking about how we are trauma-informed about the stories of our lives and how that has different implications in our leadership, which is what I cover in much greater depth and specificity in my group coaching program, Grounded and Growing, among a number of other pieces that I think are necessary for the caliber of multidimensional leadership that today's preponderance of adaptive challenges call upon us. And so the other piece about this too is, so that I talked about trauma limited a little bit, and then let's juxtapose that with trauma-agile, which, when it's done well, or someone who, from my perspective, I would, classify it as they have some trauma agility as a practitioner, as someone who's teaching or coaching or leading, which means they have an understanding, a greater depth of understanding about trauma and about people's capacity to heal, and about the reality that folks may be anywhere on that healing journey, but all people, including people who have experienced trauma, are inherently brilliant, have immense capacity for growth, and have immense capacity for powerful leadership. And that in their talking and in their discernment and navigation, and when they're teaching and leading, there is profound empathy and there is profound understanding about various sensitivities. And so they may weave in, if they're working with any given population, either a multiracial group of people, or if they're working with a monocultural or a monoracial group of people. Let's say I was working with Black folks. I would be aware that in that space, because I'm informed about, and I guess that's another layer of it, which I'm not going to get into too much, because the other piece that I didn't even think about this that we could get into is, when people are saying trauma informed, are they talking about it just on the individual level, or do they also have analysis about collective trauma and collective trauma patterns, that we don't want to get into stereotypes, but that we can see that there are useful but not universal trends that various groups of people who have been targeted for destruction, and those who have been positioned in the dominant role, have also been a part of systems of oppression. And part of how, when I teach about Oppression 101, which I've been considering doing on a live here, or like putting out a call, I weave in trauma-informed, basic levels of trauma-informed, and specifically trauma-agile insight into that. And so that we're not just talking about systems of oppression, but one of the things I state very clearly, which I'll state right now too, is that in any system of oppression, systems of oppression run fundamentally on dehumanization. And in any context where anyone is implicated in dehumanization, there is likely varying degrees of subtle to quite intense individual and collective trauma involved for everyone. There's obviously more trauma that the targeted group sustains, but when a group of people have been positioned to be in the dominant role, particularly over generations, which is what generally how the professionals and teachers and scholars from whom I've learned and who molded me in the way I've been teaching this for 20 years, that's how fundamentally we understand trauma. Is it's not one negative moment or even several years of negative experience or targeting. It's targeting typically, although there can be new forms of oppression, God forbid, but develop, but that happen over generations of time, over a sustained period, right? That has it qualify as a systemic form of oppression, right? So these are things that are happening over generations. So I wasn't even planning on getting into that, but that's something that we could also have a whole separate conversation about. And that, in the context of my group coaching and leadership program, Grounded and Growing, we take time to specifically talk about that. So Trauma-agile is ideally, so when I say trauma-informed in all my work, I am endeavoring to say, and I want to say explicitly here, that when I'm talking about trauma-informed, I'm talking about it as someone who, as a practitioner and in my own living, from my own 30-plus healing journey around extensive trauma, is trauma-agile. So I wanted to, this might be a bit much for some and also juicy for others, so just hang in there with me. So basically the trauma limited, I would say, is when when practitioners or individuals, in terms of understanding trauma, are in more of the trauma limited, which doesn't necessarily have to be bad, right? But there's just a limitation of what the trauma-informed means in their case. And so as you're seeing posts from them talking about what is or isn't possible for people with trauma, please notice, are they coming from a trauma-limited place or a limited awareness? And by that I mean limited trauma, some significant and meaningful trauma awareness, but also it has a limit, right? So if we look at Barbara Love's liberatory consciousness model talks about 4 levels that we need to establish. Some of y'all in this space are quite informed, so you might be aware of this. Okay, people positioned as oppressors also carry immense trauma. Yes, it's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, being trained in domination is a traumatic experience. Yes, and no child, okay, fine, I know people think that like maybe 0.001%, but most human children, when they are born, do not have a proclivity to oppress people. There's a sense we are a social pack species that we want to be connected and loving and connected with people across lines of difference, share different things, right? That is something. And so when people, which most humans are from birth and even pre-birth for people, we're all humans. I'm getting off topic. There's so much I could talk about, y'all. But all humans are exposed fetally to oppression, because unless you were born in an incubator, all people were born in bodies of people with uteruses, and people with uteruses are highly oppressed globally in this world. And as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches about eating our food, we're all deeply, and the human experience and energies are all deeply interconnected. So if we're being honest and realistic and thinking more deeply than white dominant culture or white supremacy culture has conditioned us to think, we would know that even before we were born, we're living in the body of someone who's been targeted by oppression. But yes, exactly what you said. Here's Sister Yiddishkeit. Yes. So in Barbara Love's liberatory leadership model, there are 4 stages. There's awareness of becoming aware of, say, racism or any form of systemic oppression. And at times, in terms of systemic oppression, some people don't even get to the level of awareness, right? But awareness is key. And people at times think awareness is all of this other stuff, sort of like people think trauma-informed, or would automatically assume, because one would think that, that all of these different things are a part of awareness, but awareness is just the first. There's lots of people say, like in American society on Turtle Island, and in many mainstream, still like heavily settler colonial societies, which is most, a lot of people don't even have an awareness of, or much awareness of systemic oppression. So that is all of these steps are important. systemic awareness. But the next natural step for most leaders, and that's really important to get deeper, is analysis, right? And the way that Barbara Love speaks about analysis is in a few different ways, and the ways that I would sort of ad-lib it and add to it is to say that analysis, when we start to get into analysis, we are integrating that awareness and that additional increasing endless knowledge, but a certain key body of knowledge into the details and texture of our living and into the contexts within which we operate. So how is this information relevant in these different spaces? How is racial injustice or systemic racial inequity or gender bias or heteronormativity or any of the various forms of, or fat phobia or any of the various forms of oppression, I can start to understand it exists and how it shows up and how people who live in bodies of different targeted identities, what their experience is. But analysis starts to get into both system-wide and also for a person. How does that start to shift and or add more texture and depth to the story of my life? Right? How do I look at people in my life who have these different identities and start to think about, again, patterns and sociological realities that they were dealing with that weren't a part of the story I was telling about them. Right? And obviously you don't have to do this entirely. This is something that we can do over time, but that's what we start to do when we get into analysis, is thinking about the different implications and moving it through the fabric of our living. And that's true also too with starting to get to a deeper layer of being trauma informed. Right. So the first layer, so to me, when I now look at something that says trauma informed, unless I have other markers or I know that entity, my general default is, well, one, just to check it out, honestly, and see. But if I'm not seeing indicators that they are trauma-agile or have more sophistication or let alone around trauma itself, as well as if they've done any work around integrating, which ideally it should, because that's how it happens in the world, integrating their understanding of systemic oppression with trauma-informed analysis, right? So I'm looking for those things so I can see, but I know that most things, wherever they are, if they're talking about it, to one extent or another, they're doing that because they're trauma-aware, right? Just like if somebody's talking about race initially, we can know that they're racially aware to a certain extent. Do they have racial analysis? I don't know yet. I need to read what they're writing. I need to see how they're showing up in the world. All of those different pieces, right? And so then the next stage after that, so in Barbara Love's model, there's 4 stages of liberatory consciousness in general, which is awareness, analysis, and then there's 2 in different models of hers. I've seen them flipped. For racial justice specifically, I like to have it in a particular order in light of my 20 years of experience working with different institutions. So in my version of it, it's awareness, analysis, then accountability. And accountability is a word that can scare folks who are in non-target identities. And so the synonym or a word that I like that to me gets the point of accountability across that doesn't feel as punitive is commitment. So in a person's living and also in the life of an institution, in what ways is there infrastructure and systems in place to ensure commitment to values around advancing racial justice and equity, inclusion and diversity within their institution, is commitment and accountability, right? And when things go wrong, how are we holding each other? And this process, how are we ensuring that this continues? Someone wrote in the chat, is trauma responsive an okay term? I think it can be, right? It's more about okay, so let me read the rest of your question. So is trauma responsive an okay term? Sweden has no awareness analysis. Shamati, I hear you, okay? I'm tracking that, et cetera. And trauma-agile would be too complicated to even introduce in passing. I think that might be too complicated to introduce, or maybe not in various spaces, to be honest with you, in the US too. Okay, would be too complicated to even introduce in passing is my belief as one of the admins. Okay, so Shamati, in my Jewish tradition at times we'll say Shamati, which means I hear you. This is a great question. So I think what I'm saying here, which is different than what's being said, because at times people don't use a certain term. I'm not saying, what I'm trying to do is bring practitioner and consumer awareness, right? Of like when somebody says trauma informed, there's a spectrum of what that means. And especially as someone who feels especially protective of my peoples and people who are adjacent to my peoples. So I am Black, Indigenous, and Jewish. I'm a member of 3 different peoples who have been targeted for destruction, which would also, that's a separate thing that I can continue to work on in my trauma healing. And so I can get in my feelings at times as a practitioner when I see people marketing things that are trauma informed, say like trauma heal, like come to this session about to experience, there was something I saw once and I can't quite remember what it was called. It was basically like Jewish trauma healing. And I don't think they meant it, but it kind of implied that the Jews attending that could heal their trauma, and it was 1 hour long. Okay. So I mentioned before earlier in this live that I am of the belief from the people from whom I have learned this wisdom, who have been doing this work for decades and helps people globally, survivors of war, physical violence, many different things, loss, many different things, that it is deeply possible for most humans to heal from most of their trauma if given the right resources and over time, with the right resources and the right practices, some of which, when it's done in the right safe container, are relatively free, right? We as humans, we're born with all of the different tools we need to heal, but we've been socialized, again, this is something that I teach in my program, Grounded and Growing, to stifle some of our foundational natural healing mechanisms. And in most societies, some of the ways that people naturally heal is heavily stigmatized. So back to what you're saying about trauma responsive. So part of that depends on the nature of what you're doing. So to me, trauma responsive, it means a word that's kind of similar to Trauma-agile, or maybe at least at the level of having some trauma analysis. So if you're doing a program where, based upon your knowledge and experience, you have a capacity to be responsibly responsive to the population, to a person within, who is within a given population, whether that's a diverse population or a specific population that has specific individual and collective patterns, like, to me, that is ideally what trauma responsive implies. And obviously, like, I'm not the arbiter of this, right? But that when I'm looking at things like that as a consumer at times, like, I mostly have my needs met through different communities I'm a part of, but I also too am also curious about what people are doing, or at times might see something and I'm like, oh, maybe that could also further help me on my ongoing trauma healing for myself, or help me as a practitioner. And I'm looking to see different things that are indicators in how they're speaking, if they have a liberatory and robust, sophisticated analysis about trauma and the ways that it intersects with systems of oppression. So in Barbara Love's model, and then the final one, so there's awareness, analysis, accountability, and action. And this is why I love Barbara Love's liberatory consciousness model, because particularly in some of the communities I'm a part of, one of the patterns that can show up in Jewish spaces is a pattern called scared active, where there's fear and terror, and an ancestrally proven best practice for Jews over the centuries has been, there's an emergency, so we're going to run. We're going to go into urgency, because over millennia, for many different, but not all, pockets of the Jewish diaspora, running in urgency was something that helped people, made the difference between life and death, right? But in the context of working on a deeply entrenched adaptive challenge and broad sweeping system of oppression like racial injustice, urgency ain't helpful. It can be helpful a little bit to help move you into action, but it is highly counterproductive. And when folks are conditioned or positioned, in terms of their identity, with identities that inherently, if they don't work on their stuff, can harm other people, immediately moving into action ain't helpful, right? And so also too, like, to kind of jump ahead, in terms of going back to the trauma piece, diving into action, trauma-informed action, again, do you have licensure? Have you spent years or decades? Have you been learning from people if you're taking a more decolonized approach? Are you steeped in accountability from multiple angles, through relationship, through ongoing training, through different systems and structures that ensure if you are going to be taking action in an area that you know what you're talking about here, right? And it cannot be sustained. Hello, burnout and further trauma potentially. Yes, that's what happens when people dive into action. Thanks for that. Yes. Oh, thank you for capturing that. Yeah. Yes. Barbara Love, 4 stages: awareness, analysis, accountability / commitment, action. Yes. Right. And so what that also means, and also what that action implies, is aligned. For another A for the win. Aligned action. Action that is in alignment with not only your awareness, with not only your analysis, but also accountability. And now we are all positioned for psychologically safe, for intercultural, greater, because there's layers of it, but greater accountability to take action in ways that are more likely to be healing and productive and in service of BIPOC and collective liberation. Yes, right? And so the paradigm operates a little differently, but based off of what that a phenomenally useful and robust model that Barbara Love teaches, that I use in any number of different ways in my consulting and teaching, is a similar model around trauma. I would use similarly. Some of this I just put together today, so I may edit this over time. Is like it may continue. Well, things are always evolving, right? It's always in draft. We know that from our movements. We continue to learn and get better. But is awareness, same thing, trauma awareness. So when people, so to me, the baseline that I always know that when people are saying that they're trauma informed, that at the very least they're trauma aware to some extent or another. They know that trauma exists and that it's somewhere in the equation, right? Versus having trauma informed analysis or trauma analysis. So which is a huge body of work. So there's varying degrees of that. Do they have trauma analysis about their own life, about the specific populations they're working with? Do they know what trauma? Do they have trauma analysis for Black folks throughout in one specific country and also throughout the African diaspora? Do they have trauma analysis for Jews? To what extent is that? Do they have trauma analysis for predominantly Ashkenazi Jews, or also for Sephardim and Mizrahim and Jews of color, right? That has similar and also different trauma patterns, right? Do they have analysis about those details and the specificity both for individuals and the collective? And again, tracking useful but not universal patterns, right? So like when I'm working with clients, I feel my sense is, and my mentors have told me that I have a very strong trauma-informed, trauma-agile analysis, which is what I'm building to, agile analysis overall. And I know as a practitioner, I have deep knowledge from 10 years of experience about different identities that affect me and ones that I'm adjacent to. So like issues affecting women and also men in the context of oppression, and gender nonconforming and non-binary folks. What are the ways that misogyny and sexism have patterns of collective and individual trauma in the lives of people, right? That's something that I have some meaningful trauma analysis around, and some of the patterns that plays out. Noting that I could deepen my specific analysis as a cis person, as a cis queer person, around some of the specificity of collective. I know I would say I have some analysis, but I'm not at the point of deeper analysis in terms of collective trauma patterns at the level of depth that I have in other areas around non-binary and trans folks, right? Like I have a sense of it, and I have way more than the average population, but at the depth that I like to be aware and work with in the context of my private trauma healing work, as well as in more non-therapeutic work that I do with my clients in the context of Grounded and Growing, where it's at awareness and giving coaching points, but then referring people to the specific trauma healing containers that they are using in their lives to go deeper, right? Anyway, I'm getting off track here, but there's gradations of this, and it's something that we can steadily build over time and have both respect for what we know and also keep in mind and track based upon what's being taught in different spaces, and also having a sense of humility and that there's a lot more that we can know. So I have a sense of like Indigenous trauma and Black trauma and Jewish collective trauma and the ways that shows up as collective patterns as well as individual patterns that can play out. And when I'm working with clients in different ways and I'm building out my library in terms of grounded and growing, if someone, say, has Muslim heritage or Asian heritage, right, in part just because as a both practitioner and recipient of trauma healing, that some of my learning comes from the education, but also from being in affinity spaces. So for me, when I'm speaking one-on-one about, certain members of my community joining my community, I might say to them, I might ask them to give me some additional insight, and then I can help them. I can identify for them and find a number of phenomenal resources that speak specifically to some of their people's patterns, right? And I have a sense of some of the collective, and like going on a rabbit hole here, so a sense of like collective trauma in the context of Turtle Island and specifically America, in terms of the lasting impact, right? Some of the wonderful teaching and analysis of Dr. Joy DeGruy around the ongoing impact, and Dr. Joy DeGruy's work around the U.S. and the impact that slavery had is a really wonderful example of someone who has an understanding at the level of trauma agility, post-traumatic growth and trauma agility, and also has woven and is woven throughout that a deep understanding of systemic oppression, that those things are operating multidimensionally, are operating simultaneously, which is one example of what I mean when I'm talking about multidimensional analysis. Then the last two stages that I would talk to in terms of being about different levels of trauma informed would be, is this person a practitioner for themselves and or with the clientele with whom they work, who works at the level of post-traumatic growth, which when I'm saying trauma limited, they are not at the level of recognizing that people with the right tools, and there's a diversity of them, and there's some core things that are involved that can take shape in any number of different ways, but that there are various tons right now of posts on social media that I can tell that person who's writing that, either in general or in that moment about that topic, because as a number of us know, our understanding and the way our mind and our being works is a bit like layers of an onion. I was recently reminded by my friend and partner Tracy that in pleasure activism, a metaphor is used by Audre Lorde about mixing margarine and some of the yellow and kneading the yellow throughout the shortening when they needed to make something that looked right, when they needed to make margarine. And so similarly, our consciousness is similar. So when I see this, to be clear, again, there's a lot of nuance, and I want to be encouraging this more for different folks in different ways, that when I look on social media, when I see something, I think this is a trauma-limited post. If I repeatedly see someone post, like a specific account posting this, I might be like their trauma awareness is at the level of, is limited. There's all this other stuff, right? But in general, if I just see a one-off thing, I wouldn't necessarily ascribe trauma-limited analysis to that person, but I would say this post, because I don't have enough data, right? But I would say this post is in a place of trauma-limitedness. That, there's trauma, stop. So like another example, I was seeing a popular coach, and she was having an internal coaching industry sort of conversation on her Instagram about the nature of pricing and pricing transparency or lack thereof. And she said something about how, people who don't post their prices are not trauma informed. And there's there might be some legitimacy to that, and she said a little bit more, but it really bothered me in that moment as someone who at times has experienced a number of forms of hardship, and as someone who has a substantial history of trauma, that in that moment, the way she said that, and I think in retrospect, as I've reflected on it over the past few months, I think she might have also been talking about herself. And there's a way where at times some people, I'm just wary. I'm wary. To me, other signs of a trauma-limited approach is when there's a sense of permanent disempowerment of those who have been traumatized, which I do not subscribe to. I think people can obviously be temporarily, and that can extend long-term, but it's not, but that can experience disempowerment, can be in a tender place, need of care. And there was also in this person, in this coach's what she was saying, there was a sense to me a little bit of like saviorism. Like part of me also was reading that she was part and part talking about, maybe not, I don't think exclusively, but the way it read to me was like she was sort of had like people of color in her mind. And there was a way where I felt like she was talking for me and for other people of color. And I just felt like this isn't quite the way to be thoughtful about us. Like there was just ways where it was used, I think you know what I'm saying, but to me the overall thing was like trauma limited. And actually people with immense trauma and varying degrees of trauma, small trauma and big T trauma, can be at any point of accessibility to any number of things. Like that's a less sophisticated understanding of trauma. So trauma awareness, trauma analysis, and then getting into something that's kind of equivalent to accountability and commitment is post-traumatic growth. So part of is as a practitioner, is this person aware that there is potential for post-traumatic growth? And is that reflected in what they're saying? That people can go through horrific things over the course of their lives, and that with the right interventions and with the right supports over time through practice, there can be immense healing to the point where it is profoundly empowering, and not that it ever justifies the original harm. Let me be clear about that. But they can be in a much stronger and more empowered place afterward if an intervention, usually in community or qualified folks, which can be in a colonial, traditional sense, and also can be in a decolonized sense, with people who have been in deep with a community or collective of people who have been in practice for decades collectively around refining their practice and what they're doing, right? And have other various forms of accountability. But that there's a capacity for growth, that something can happen, and that through this healing, we can grow and not only get through it, but actually be stronger and have more insight, right? That is totally within the realm of possibility for humans. And finally, the final stage of that is agility. And to me, what agility implies here is several different things, but is an awareness and access, or awareness of an ability to access all these other stages. And at any given moment, understanding, having a sense of what's needed. And for a practitioner, agility implies, it can imply a lot of different things, right? Like I don't want to be overly prescriptive here, but it can imply a capacity to help individuals or groups of people responsibly engage in individual and collective healing. And part of the agility is knowing in what circumstances or context that is and isn't appropriate. And there is and isn't enough infrastructure and accountability and safety and all of the different things that are necessary for there to be the conditions for responsible and protected and mindful opportunities for healing. Right? So there's like the levels of awareness, analysis, post-traumatic growth, and agility. So to me, agility also implies a repeating of the process, a capacity, again, and so there are variations of as an individual, that you're in a space where you have resources to know. Agility to me is also implying like a sense of awareness that I don't want to go through something horrible, but I have now gone through multiple, not just one, but multiple experiences of post-traumatic growth. And or as a practitioner, I have successfully and responsibly led people, multiple people, various people in different contexts through post-traumatic growth. And again, as I was naming before about the analysis, it can be situational, right? And so you'll hear different practitioners at times be responsible stewards of their knowledge and their skill. And at times say, this is the population, these are the issues, these are the places in which, as a practitioner, I am trauma-agile. And they will have integrity if someone comes to them, which doesn't happen in different spaces, to say, I have a lot of knowledge and I haven't specifically worked with such and such, right? And in some cases, one really needs some of that material, and in other cases, because trauma in a number of ways has common trends, whatever the specific subject matter is, where there's some elements of trauma healing that can take place. So those are the 4 levels, and just to kind of my shorthand for it, which I recognize could in the wrong context be misunderstood or taken out and used in a weaponized way, which is not how I mean to use it. But that when I see trauma-informed, in short, to me, I'm looking to see, are they trauma-aware / trauma-limited? Or is this a space where they are supportive of or aware of the capacity for post-traumatic growth and or have the tools to help facilitate that? And even better, if they are trauma-agile. Not always, but often to me. I'm also looking at the amount of time or the level of experience, right? Like, I look at it and consider it because someone has been trained in this, so they may have some really solid awareness and analysis, but if they're just 1 or 2 years into this, the depth and complexity that human trauma can take, it's hard for me to imagine if someone was like in a really serious intent, that like there's certain bars that I'm looking for, and some of that may or may not matter, and depending upon what they're offering and what they are guaranteeing. Are they offering actual trauma healing? Which, depending, if they're not licensed and or created a really powerful container, or are they doing something like that I'm doing, where I'm saying I am trauma informed, and my space and my programs are not therapeutic spaces. They're spaces in which I can help you cultivate awareness and analysis, and they are spaces that are pro post-traumatic growth and pro and they're trauma-informed, like agility, positive spaces in Joyous Justice land, but they are spaces in which I say right now, as the single owner with 1 additional staff person, we don't have the infrastructure right now, and there's just a lot of additional resourcing that we would need in order to have this be an explicitly therapeutic space. So we're not doing that, but at times when I'm coaching people in a group context or in one-on-one coaching, one of my favorites is when someone has actually a trauma healing community or practitioner with whom they're working, usually a therapist, and I can give them, without eliciting the trauma too much, I can give them different things that I know from my counter-oppressive practice to say, okay, in light of what you're sharing, here, take some notes. Here are some exercises that you can ask your therapist to do with you, since they're a person who's tracking you more closely and they know more of the context than I have. But based upon what you're saying here and what I know about the fundamental ways that trauma consistently operates for pretty much all humans, here are some places where you could do some of that deeper work. And here are some ways where you could access that visceral experience in a safe and licensed context. And or for some folks, if they're in a responsible, appropriate, decolonized context that you can use, that you can bring some of these prompts to that context and they can hold you in the actual trauma healing space. And then the trauma healing that I practice, I practice within the container of a network, of a private network that I'm a part of, and only in that context. So this has been on my chest. Thanks for a while now. Thank you for tuning in. There's obviously there's various things that I touched upon. There's a lot more, but I wanted to toss this out there since it's so cool right now to always be talking about trauma-informed, that not all these things are created equal, and we get to be mindful consumers and take note of what actually we're reading and what's the caliber of it. Because at times people are saying, if I didn't already say this, people are saying to cut off ties with relationship. There's ways where I see, not exclusively, where I either see a traumatized mentality being touted as trauma-informed, and there's a difference between traumatized, and that's also a variation of the trauma-limited, and actual trauma-informed, and telling people to do things that in certain situations is appropriate, but as a general rule, just because you're engaged in conflict with someone, there's ways to me where, not exclusively, where like sexism and white dominant culture and white supremacist delusion is like very subtly weaving in, and it's encouraging people to isolate, right? Whereas what I've learned from people, nearly all people who are trauma-agile, educators, practitioners, and healers, is that we want to be reaching for connection. And then at different points in certain extenuating circumstances, we need to set boundaries. And over time, as we heal more in different ways, ideally all people are deserving and have the capacity, when we have the support around us and we've had time to heal. And that healing might be a decade. I'm not saying it's a weekend, but it might be over a long period of time, that we have the power of choice to reach for different relationships, to rescript different things, that we have immense capacity and power. So thank you everyone for joining. If this is something where you're interested in getting deeper support, or you would like some Trauma-agile coaching and support, then feel free. I have offerings right now to work one-on-one or do an intensive series. I can't remember if I've added it yet, but I will. If you want to just contact me at joyousjustice.com. I have a contact form if you're interested in engaging with me, but none of the specific offers are the right fit, or you want to collaborate. I'm really happy to collaborate with kindred spirits around this, and much love. And I think I want to end as someone who's soon going to be ordained as a Jewish priestess. I'd like to end with a kavanah, a little bit of intention, and say, may it be divine oneness's will that increasingly over time, all of us are able to gain access to empowering knowledge and information that supports us in being aware that each of us individually are always and unconditionally deeply deserving of love, and as members of societies and communities that have hundreds and thousands of years of collective trauma, that nearly all of us have different patterns of allowing harm and or of causing harm. And it's my prayer and my intention that through the many wonderful, brilliant minds who are sharing knowledge today, spiritually, professionally, interpersonally, that we can continually know and viscerally feel increasingly that inherent goodness that is within all of us, and we can have increasing courage and support to hold that inherent goodness, looking at the layers of hurt, and get support of hurt and of harm, and get support around healing and mending those different dynamics in service of collective liberation, in service of our joy, and in service of joyous justice. May it be so. I'm hoping to start showing up live a lot more. I've been going through a really intentional, intense process of really root level trauma healing over the past 3 years, and it's still ongoing. It's going to be lifelong, but I'm getting to the other side of a huge body of work, and I'm going to be showing up more, heaven willing. So hopefully this will be one of many more opportunities for us to connect. You're so very welcome. I'm really glad this landed well. I thought about this a couple months ago, and then I was like, I want to nuance this well, because there's ways at times that things can be misunderstood. So I wanted to give it time so that it would land in a way that was of service to people, and not in a way that induced shame, but instead empowered us with more knowledge and more resource to advance justice and our healing and our joy. Thanks so much. We'll connect again soon. Feel free to be in touch.
Thanks for tuning in.
To learn more about Joyous Justice LLC, our team, and how you can get involved with our community, check out the info in our show notes or find us at joyousjustice.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, show us some love.
Subscribe wherever you're listening.
Tell your people. Share what you're learning and how your leadership is evolving.
Stay humble,
But not too humble,
and keep going.
because the future is ours to co-create.